Next, now that you're primed, now that you have finance on your mind, I offer you an address from the First Selectman, former Chair of the Board of Finance, Jon Zagrodzky.
Thank you, Seth. I appreciate the chance to talk to you, so I'm going to wear both hats, Board of Finance and First Selectman tonight, to talk a little bit about town's indebtedness. So this is a little different kind of presentation. The genesis of this was me just kind of sitting back and thinking about the schools and Great Island and really thinking about the town's financial situation and the debt that we're incurring and will incur because we're spending money on those things. And so I started to talk to a few folks, some of you here, and said, well, you know what, I'll just do a video, like I do all these videos and these different topics. But then it occurred to me that this body has two unique and important features. The first feature is that I can't spend a dime unless it's appropriated by this body, and you tell me I can spend that dime. Like any legislative system, this body has the ultimate appropriating authority, and I know you guys take that very seriously. And so I wanted to come to this body to start talking about our debt situation directly. The second reason for doing this is you guys have one other unique feature, which is there are 100 of you, and they're in districts spread out all over town. I know a lot of people and talk to a lot of people. There is zero chance that I know as many people as you do. And so when we have a discussion about the decisions that we're going to need to think about carefully with regard to the town's debt situation, this is going to kick off a process where you're going to be able to take this information and go talk to the people that you know, get their input and get their reaction and see what they think about this. And then you'll be able to come back to this body or to the Board of Finance or to me directly and say, hey, this is what I'm hearing. Could we talk about that a little bit? Some of my constituents are okay with it. Maybe others are concerned. This presentation today is meant to sort of kick off a process of building your confidence in education, and I don't mean that in a patronizing way, about this issue, and to make sure that an understanding of all this permeates any decision making or questions or actions that you guys take with regard to a lot of spending that we have teed up and in the future. It's important to note that this is a high-level presentation meant to talk conceptually about all of this. This is not a Jim Palin presentation with lots of spreadsheets and all numbers tied back with detailed debt service down to the penny over a long period of time. I'm going to let him cover all of that. In preparing this, I worked with him, but also worked with Jill McCammon of the Board of Education, some of the folks who are architects for school construction, Jen Charneski and Rich Rudel, all of that. Everybody's kind of had input into this. So what you're going to see is something that's detached from our normal processes, detached from the 5-year capital plan, but starts to tee up this issue of town indebtedness. So let's get started. So the key concern, as I said, we've got a lot of capital spending, and should we be worried about that? It's a good question, and this is meant to sort of kick off a process to build that understanding. So the issues that I want to focus on is I'm going to talk a little bit about current and historical debt load so that you have a sense of what that is. I want to talk about projected capital spending, and I want to make sure that it's capital spending that's going to be bonded. You'll notice that in every budget we have, there's always small capital spending and some CapEx, say with the fire departments. None of that is typically bonded. As Jack was saying, we're trying to bond things that are north of $1 million. So what we're talking about here is not total capital, we're talking about total bonded capital expenditures. And then once we have that, I want to look at the impact on taxpayers of all the debt service that's associated with that, and then ask another question, which is, well, if we have this extra debt, what about our town's credit rating? Is that going to be impacted? And if so, is that bad? Okay. So the first specific question is, how have debt levels trended over time, and what projects contributed to that debt load? So if you take a look at this slide, this will give you a sense of where we are at the moment. So this dates back to, old and blind, 2015. And you'll see that I've broken the debt out into school-related debt and town-related debt. Now, oops, right here. All right, so what you'll see on this slide is Starting in about 2015, we had a debt load of about $77 million, a combination of town and school debt. And that remained relatively flat to slightly declining until kind of 2021. I recall that's the year I handed over the Board of Finance to Jim Palin, but okay, so just checking. And started to build from there. But you see here in 2024, what I've included in that debt figure is all of our bonded debt, as well as the bond anticipation notes that have not actually been converted to long-term debt for Great Island. So when you include all of that, which I'm kind of counting because it's going to be long-term debt anyway, you can see that kind of as of the end of last year and kind of right about now, we've gone from a low on this page of about $60 million in 2019 to now $192 million. And just for context, that's an absolute historic high. Even when we were borrowing for the high school and we had, as much debt as I ever saw in 13 years on the Board of Finance, we were never anywhere close to this. So part of the reason we're having this discussion is because I saw that and said, we got to talk about this and figure things out. So I've circled a couple numbers here. I've circled 2017 just as kind of a starting point and the 192. And let's take a look at what caused the difference, what got us from the 62 up to the 192. So it's a few things. The first thing is a quick look at the 62. That really is comprised of, as we've done before, school and town debt for the schools. Back at that time, there was still some high school debt in there. Still, we had token-eat debt that we were still paying off. And on the town side, it was the police department, still a large part at that time, as well as some other debt. So the 62 million kind of is a starting point. Now, since then, we bought Highland Farms, a little less than $7 million. We made the investment in Ox Ridge. You'll see that number is 48 million, even though the headline of the project was north of 60 million. Keep in mind, we got some state grants to cover that. There were also bond premiums built in here that reduced our borrowing costs, and so the amount that we actually bonded for that school was about 48 million. We, at this point, have bonded about $29 million in HHR spending. We also have this $90 million in Great Island. That was the $85 million in acquisition costs, plus call it another 5 for startup costs. And then another 15 and so for fire trucks and kind of all of that since then, which takes the subtotal up to $251 million. And then over that time period, we had principal payments of about $59 million. So that gives you kind of a waterfall that gets you from the debt that we had of $62 million in 2017 to what we're facing today in 2024 of $192 million. Okay. So we've answered the first question about debt levels trending over time. Next question is, what additional debt might we expect to take on over the next, call it 7 years? And when would we take on that debt? And this could be additions to existing projects or brand new debt. So I've talked to a number of people about this, and the numbers that I'm going to show you are really projections, and they're meant to kind of provide a directional sense of where that debt could go so we could get our minds around a quantum and a rough timing and take a look at the implications of that. So I've broken this up into some categories that we can take a look at. The first one is if we think about the time period, this is all in millions of dollars, and it's from kind of current fiscal year 25 through 2032. The reason, by the way, I picked 2032 is that it's a date when I think we might reasonably be finished with the next big capital project, which is a renovation of Middlesex Middle School. So over that, call it 7-year period, I think you'd expect that we would do one fire vehicle per year, roughly $2 million each. That's more than we're spending now, but as Jack points out, there's long delivery times and a lot of inflation. My guess is that when we take another look at the fire apparatus vehicle, we'll probably take one of those out of that. The rest of it will be eaten up by inflation. In terms of flooding, we've got 2 projects, as you know, we've talked about before, Saltbox and Grove Street over on near Bailey Avenue. Those projects right now are estimated at $6.5 and $3.5, and over the next couple of 3 years, we'd spend $10 million to get those 2 projects done. Weed Beach and Pear Tree Point, both of which Jack have talked about, and we'll talk more at a later date. The current estimates on that are $7 million and $2 million. We've asked for slightly more to cover if a bid goes higher than what's the current estimate is, but there's a good chance that we'd be able to get those projects done for the amounts that I show here. And then other, if you look back at our run rate capital in the town budget for stuff, right? Not anything on this list, but other things that are big enough to merit bonding. over the last 7 years, say for the next 7 years, I merely just projected that forward, and the total bonding for that period would be roughly $31 million. And this is what I want to spend a minute on. So how much money are we going to spend on Great Island going forward? So we already spent the $90 million that we talked about. And one of the things that the Great Island Committee is wrestling with as part of the development of their strategic plan is just how much more do we want to spend. I assure you, we could spend a massive amount of money on Great Island. I mean, anybody who's built a house here knows how much it costs to build it. This is a 60-acre piece of property with a lot of really old buildings. You know how much money we could spend. In my opinion, I think what we should do, and part of the reason for this presentation, is to think about our debt capacity and what we're comfortable with in terms of debt service, and start to say, this is the budget that we'd like to have over the next 5 to 7 years for that project, and then back into a series of things that we would do within that budget. I say that because if you look at Waveney Park up in New Haven, or in New Canaan, and you look over at Todd's Point in Greenwich, they did the same thing. Right? Nobody goes out and spends a massive amount of money to develop those properties overnight. You can't get the contractors to do the work anyway. So there's no reason for us to go in and spend a huge amount of money right away on Great Island. Instead, phasing it in over time, where we have a chance to look at progress, think about the best ways to do things, gather public input and see how much more we want to do. I think that taking an approach like that makes a lot of sense. Now the question is going to be, how much money do we want to spend in that phase over this kind of 5-7 year period? Is it $50 million? Is it $30 million? Is it $80 million? I don't think it's much more than $80-90 million over that time period. I'm not sure we could spend that efficiently, but there's a number. And what I want to do is use that number to say, okay, if we just assume that for now, what does our total debt picture look like, and are we concerned? Because if you have that overall understanding, it's going to help all of us be a lot better informed about making a choice to set that budget and say, this is the budget we want. Now go in and let's figure out a smart way to do that so that we maximize the utility of this property for everybody in town. So my stake in the ground, just to start the conversation, is to say, what about $50 million? And let's see what we could do with that. And then once that's finished, say 5 years from now, we could spend another tranche of money and further develop that island. No rush, do it in a smart way, but do it consistent with a view and a strategy about how much debt we want to have. So over that period of time, that gives us a total debt for the town that we would incur of $113 million. For schools, what I have here for HHR, that's the remainder of what we need to bond for the HHR project that's still outstanding, less some state grants, so call it another 53. Middlesex, I had some conversations with a few folks today, including the architects who've been doing renovations for those schools. Just as a cool number to have, anybody want to take a guess as to what it would cost to take down and rebuild Middlesex School? That's a 193,000 square foot building. That's $750 to $800 a square foot to renovate that. You're looking at $150 to $160 million to take down Middlesex School and start over like we did the high school. It ain't the high school days anymore. This is what this stuff is going to cost. Middlesex is actually a building that's in pretty good shape. It's not like Ox Ridge Elementary School, which was a disaster, and we had to take that down. My strong sense in talking to folks is this is going to be another building that we renovate like the 3 elementary schools. And so the question is what would that cost based on a conversation with the architects today? A minimal approach, maybe 40 million, maximum 60 million. I've put in, or 80 million. I've put in 60 million. That's about twice as much money as it is costing now to renovate elementary schools, and those have portable buildings they're having to take out. So if you think just directionally, that feels like a good estimate for a renovation of that building. And again, the architects seem to confirm that today. So could be more, could be less, but to put a stake in the ground in something that feels directionally right, I've got a placeholder of 60 million for that. And then finally, over time, again, looking back, there's an estimate that they would spend another $20 million in bondable expenditures on everything from roof repairs to 35 Leroy to other things of that nature over that 7-year period. Given the schools a total of 134 million, and the total new debt, assuming you believe all those scenarios, over that period to 2032, of call it $247 million. Now, this slide is a little denser, but the only thing I did was I took that $247 million that you see at the bottom and I said, all right, let's talk about just spreading this over that 7-year period. When might we spend that money? Not much to glean from this other than I'll point out estimates of when I think this would be spent. Now, by the way, when you talk about bonding, typically you'll have the expenditure and then the bonding takes place the following year, just the way this all works in our planning. And so for fiscal 27, that's when we would bond, for example, Pear Tree Point and Weed Beach. So I have that expenditures taking place then. That's also mathematically when you start to trigger, say, a debt service calculation, because you'd not pay principal in the first year, and then debt service would kick in for the length of time that that bond extends. I've also got Great Island expenditures, so assuming we come up and stabilize our plan and start to move forward with construction work, whatever that is, you can see where I've layered in the $50 million there. And then finally, if we do Middlesex, my guess is that's kind of starting in 2029, gives a chance for our HHR projects to be finished, for this to be architected, and for that construction to start and that bonding to start. Okay. So now the next question is, now that we have a sense of all that, how does all that translate into additional debt service requirements, and what are the taxpayer implications? So I think if we first take a look at modeling all of this, I have a few assumptions that Jennifer and I have spent time on. I won't talk too much about it, but I just want to be clear that we had to make some assumptions to simplify this discussion. It's consistent with how we've looked at this stuff in the past, so I'm okay with it. We borrowed for as long as we can on every project. Makes sense. 2 years, I misspoke. It's 2 years before we actually start principal repayments, and that's typical of what we've done in the past. I couldn't do anything more than assume current interest rates. I don't know what's going to happen to those, neither do you, so let's pick that. Current bands, which are bond anticipation notes, you put those in place before you actually put in permanent financing. We've assumed that those all get converted to amortizing debt next year. And I've made no assumptions for refinancing. So when I was on the Board of Finance, we typically would do that to take advantage of an opportunity to reduce interest rates on debt. And so that may minimize things in the future, but I've made no assumptions for that. Caveats: cost uncertainty, as I've mentioned, it could be a pretty wide range. Timing uncertainty, does Middlesex start when I said it's going to start? I don't know. And then finally, unanticipated investments. This list might not be complete. That said, so let's take a look at what the projected debt levels would be. So the way this was calculated was we started with the numbers that you recall from over there. So 2024, there's the 192 that you see. You can see how the debt levels will trend over time with all the assumptions that I just did. And what we did was we took those debt levels and we also recalculated, okay, what would the repayment of both principal and interest look like, and can we feed those principal payments into this so you have both growth in the debt as well as like that red box on the chart that I showed before. And you can see that by 2032, we would be sitting at $368 million in debt. That's a big number. But it's important, I think, to lay these assumptions out for everything that we can think of so that we can look at this and say, how do we feel about that? And start to message that to people that we know, to citizens in town, start that dialogue and make sure everybody is eyes open about the decisions that we need to make. So then what we did was the debt servicing, which we calculated at the same time as all this, I wanted to show what this looked like, because this will give you a sense of what the annual debt service is going to look like on an annual basis. And so for a long time, debt service has been in the $15, $16, $17 million a year. You'll recall that from budget presentations. You'll see that in this model that get out to 2032, this debt service starts to get up to $27 million. So a lot higher than what it's been historically. And in addition, if you try to say, okay, what does that mean for the average taxpayer? Well, in this case, what we did was to calculate the debt service per $1 million of assessed home value or business value by fiscal year, assuming the current year fiscal 25 grand list, and this is in dollars. So you can see in 2024, of all the taxes you're paying, out of the property taxes you're paying, $1,150 of that was going to debt service. By 2032, you'll be paying $2,450 in debt service. One of the things I would point out, I'll get to that point in a minute, but that, again, these are the implications of this borrowing. Is it devastating? No, we're not going to wipe anybody out with that, but it's clearly going to be a financial burden that everybody in town is going to need to pay. And then finally, I wanted to look at the debt service as a percentage of the general fund budget. And by general fund, I mean it excludes sewer and parking and that sort of thing. So in talking to Jim Palin, and I've thought about this a little bit myself, one of the things I've felt like was maybe a reasonable ceiling to think about for debt service was trying to keep it under 10% of the general fund budget. And so you can see starting in 2030, 2031, we start to get north of that, starts to get up closer to 11, even up to 12% in 2032. So again, all slides painting the same picture, which says that we've got a lot of prospective borrowing and we're going to have a lot of debt service that has impact on taxpayers everywhere. So the last question I wanted to address is, does this prospective level of indebtedness threaten our credit rating? And what are the implications for prioritizing capital spending? Okay, so for credit rating implications, the first thing to note is that Darien has maintained a AAA, which is the highest AAA credit rating since at least 1994. So that's as far back as I was able to get data. So north of 30 years, we've always had the best possible credit rating. When we get rated by Moody's and they come in and they try to say, okay, well, let's confirm whether you still have a AAA credit rating, they look at a whole long list of things. It's mainly kind of three factors: the overall economy, financial performance in the town, and then, of course, leverage. And part of the financial performance includes things like our budget process, which, listening to Jack today, it just is a reminder that we have a robust process. The quality of our management, our finance staff, and Jen Charneski have won sort of the top award from GFOA for the last, well, since as long as I've been doing this. So there are a lot of factors that contribute to Darien's good credit rating. It's not just our overall level of indebtedness. But that said, we don't really have control over the economy, so we need to focus on our overall leverage as well as our performance as a town. Economic strength, our grand list, all of those things. So we did speak with our bond advisor about all of this and proposed all of this and showed him these are the numbers that we're talking about in terms of prospective debt. What do you think? Is that going to affect our credit rating? His sense was that, taking into account all of Darien and everything that goes into that rating, and the fact that he's actually looked at us for years and years, his sense is that our debt would have to be north of $500 million before eyebrows would start to raise about the level of debt that we're taking on. We're not going to get there, even with the assumptions that even if we add a lot to the assumptions that I put in here, we will never get anywhere close to that in my judgment. He does recommend adding to fund balance if we're going to do that, just to ensure the ratings agencies that we have enough reserves if something goes bad. That's another thing that would add to taxpayer burden, because adding to reserves means that as you grow your reserves, you're actually taxing slightly more than what our operating budgets require. So again, at the point that he made back to us, he said, look, you can do this, but threat to your rating aside, the fact is that the fund balance additions, as well as all this debt service, is going to add a lot of pressure, not just on your budget, but on your average taxpayers. An interesting point that he made, though, is that let's say they did downgrade us by a notch or two, and even with current interest rates, the spread between, say, AAA and 2 notches down from that is only 25 basis points. And so that the prospect of a ratings decrease, in my judgment, is low, given the data and numbers that I've showed you. But even if that were to happen, the interest rate cost of that actually happening on the debt service that we have projected here is in fact quite minimal. So last slide. So what does all this mean in terms of capital prioritization? So one thing that's interesting to note is that by the time they finish Middlesex, we really only have, as far as I know, one major capital project to go. Assuming we hold off on anything else with Great Island, it's probably just a renovation of Darien High School. Can anybody believe this year that school is 20 years old? I can scarcely believe it, but it is. And so the implication of that is that you'll reach an apex in town debt, because the way these schedules work is we do fairly aggressively pay down that debt, and you'll start to see the debt service numbers that I described. Those will start to come down in the 2030s because of that. So in one sense, we could make these bets, these investments today, knowing that, except for the high school, our debt service is going to start to, over time, get back to lower levels. It's not going to be a permanent situation. Projected debt levels, in my judgment, and the debt service that I just described, is it concerning? Absolutely. You should all be concerned about that. I don't think that it's dispositive, though, as being a decisive reason for rejecting any capital project. So as you guys consider that as part of your final appropriation decision, I think things like Weed Beach or other projects, you may decide that those are things you want not to do or want to see modified in some way. But the prospective debt situation for those smaller capital projects, I don't think should be a decisive factor in you making that determination. Instead, what I would do is do what you've always done, which is I've watched this body many times and in at least 2 different roles in your deliberations on capital projects. Take the time to go through them, and in your judgment as the final appropriating authority, does this make sense for this town? You have your feelers all over this town. You will be best informed to help us make that final decision. I'll do what I can from the town side to inform that decision for you, but you guys are in a unique position to help us with that, and I would urge you to continue to do the good job that you do. Which leaves us with really the key decision that's going to have to be made really over the next 5 years. The Great Island Master Plan is coming in mid-July, right? That's the committee that Mark described. That's their focus right now. They've gone into that next phase. And coming out of that, we're going to see lots of options and costs of those options to consider. But we're all going to need to come up with, both the Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and the RTM, how much do we want to spend on Great Island to make that the asset that we want it to be for everyone in town, and when do we want to spend it? Because those numbers and those decisions will affect all of this. I'll close by saying that, as I said at the beginning, I really want this to be start of an education process for you all to get more comfortable with these numbers and what they mean, and then to empower you to go out and talk to your constituents and get feedback from them. I want to hear from you. If there's something in this presentation that is a question, you are welcome to call me. You know where I live. Come see me. I'm happy to talk to you about any of this. Jim Palin, I spoke to him several times today and tonight. He's going to follow up with a lot more detail, which is his role in clarifying this and getting down into the nitty-gritty. But at a high level, I wanted to make sure that you guys had a chance to see and understand all of this. I'll be back at some point in the future, particularly if you guys think about this and come up with some questions or things you'd like me to address, or other members of my board or other committees or boards. But let's use this day to sort of kick off this process and make sure you guys are well informed to play your unique and vital role in this process. Thank you for your attention. I hope it's been helpful.